If English isn't your first language, the feeling of having to constantly ask people to repeat themselves can be even more frustrating, especially because it can make you feel like you're being repetitive, saying, "Can you repeat that, please?" all the time. And yeah, it's part of the learning process. It's actually great that you're putting yourself out there and actually connecting with people. And there's nothing wrong with asking people to repeat and try again. I just want to state that. The aim of this lesson is to expand your vocabulary so you don't feel limited by the same expression. Can you repeat that, please? Over and over again. And it will automatically boost your confidence a little bit in these awkward situations because, after all, you're going to be able to express yourselves in multiple ways in your second language. How amazing is that? And I'm also going to tell you in this lesson what not to do. And I'm going to give you a 3-step process to help you navigate those tricky moments. So give yourself a pat on the back, and when you finish this lesson, you will know at least 16 ways to ask someone politely to repeat in British English. But first off, let's start talking about things I recommend you don't do, things that I recommend you avoid doing or saying to ask somebody to repeat something. And the first is making noises. Making noises like, eh, huh? These sorts of noises are generally considered by quite a few people in the UK to be rude, especially on their own, to show that you've misunderstood. Now, you may get away with it more with close friends or family, but even then, some people, like my mother, they don't like it. If I say, to my mum, she will instantly say, back at me. She doesn't like it at all. She finds it quite rude. And it's possibly because you're making a noise rather than using words. So generally, I would suggest that you avoid doing it. You may get away with it in certain situations, but generally I'd say to try to avoid them. But on a side note, I will say if you're using them in a combination, like making a noise and then saying something, then that can work. Like, sorry, what did you say? That can work a bit more because it's part of a structure and you've actually used words. But in general, making noises like, it could be considered quite rude in the UK. Another one you may want to avoid is the word what. Now, this one depends more, in my opinion, on tone. So you need to be careful. I'm going to talk about tone of voice later in the lesson, but what can sound a little bit flippant, especially if delivered with a kind of flat tone. What? Now, this one you may get away with more if you have a kind of rising tone and a much more open face, like this. What? But again, I would use it in combination with other words like sorry to make it a bit politer. Like, sorry, what? But what, as an isolated word, could be a little bit dangerous, especially if you use the wrong tone of voice. But if you use the right tone of voice, it may be more acceptable. But in general, I would say definitely with the noises and what, you should consider avoiding those in the UK. So those are the ones that I would suggest avoiding. But now let's move on to one of the most common ways that British people ask people to repeat things. The most common way to ask somebody to repeat themselves in British culture is just saying sorry. Now, this isn't included on that list of 16. I've got 16 more expressions, but I wanted to get this one out of the way first. Sorry is a great way to ask somebody to repeat themselves, to say it again. So they say something, you didn't quite understand what they said. Sorry? With that kind of rising intonation, it shows that something's missing. And by the way, that word sorry doesn't always mean sorry. It's not always an apology. Here it just simply means, could you repeat that? Sorry? And make sure that your face shows that you didn't understand. But hello, you wonderful people. Welcome to English Right Now. My name is British English Teacher Roy, and I've been doing this for quite some time. I've been doing this for nearly 16 years, helping learners just like you to understand things in British English. Pronunciation in a modern British RP accent, British culture, slang and idioms, and generally understanding the way that British people work. And in this lesson, I'm going to teach you some really natural ways to ask people to repeat themselves. We've already talked about what not to do with the and the what in general situations, but we're also going to talk about tone of voice and a 3-step method. And if you want to learn even more about this lesson, there's a free PDF that you can download in the description below. And please do remember to like and hype the lesson. It helps other learners to learn as well. But now let's crack on with those 16 expressions, 16 ways of saying, can you repeat that, please? Or asking somebody to repeat that. So we've already said sorry, but quite often we'll say something like, oh, could you say that again, please? So this is a really polite way to ask somebody to repeat what they've just said. So you might want to add the word sorry in front. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later on, but could you say that again, please? It's just a polite way of asking somebody to repeat. And likewise, an alternative to this with a similar kind of idea, would you mind saying that again, please? They both work in all situations. You could do them in the workplace, you could use them down the pub, wherever you want. Would you mind saying that again, please? It's like saying, is it an inconvenience for you to repeat? Of course, they will repeat. If you're with friends, you could also say, what was that? Now, this one is really informal. So it's more common with friends, but what was that? Again, with that kind of rising intonation to show that you're genuinely engaged, that you want somebody to repeat something. What was that? You're basically showing that you missed some key information and you want it repeated. Now, you'll notice that sorry and those three examples have all been questions. But quite commonly, to get somebody to repeat something, we actually highlight that we didn't understand something. So rather than asking a question, we show a problem. An example of this is, I didn't catch that. To catch basically means that you missed something. I didn't catch that. You can combine these. We'll talk about that 3-step process a little bit later on, but you could also add a word like quite to show that you almost understood, but you missed maybe just 1 or 2 key words. Like, sorry, I didn't quite catch that. I'm a bit lost is quite informal. It's something we say like when we've just lost the track of the conversation. Like somebody's telling a story and maybe you've got a little bit distracted. Something's going off in the corner of the room and you come back and it's totally your fault. You might say, sorry, I'm a bit lost. You could even do this down the phone. Like if somebody's calling you from a sales company, sorry, I'm a bit lost. In other words, it means you don't totally understand what's happening. Another similar example to I didn't quite catch that is I missed what you said, or I missed that. By saying I missed what you said, it's effectively showing that part of the information was lost, and therefore you need it repeating. Like I say, we don't always ask directly that people repeat things. Sometimes we just highlight that it was our fault. This is a key part of British culture. A similar example to I missed what you said is I didn't get that. I didn't get that. Get is a really versatile word, and in this case, it could mean something like understand or obtain the information. In other words, I didn't get it. I didn't receive the information, or I didn't understand. It works in both ways. So if somebody says something, you could just say, oh, sorry, I didn't get that. It basically shows they haven't communicated their point. And it's kind of making it about you, which is a really important thing to do in British culture. I'm going to talk about that 3-step method towards the end of the lesson, but I would say if you want to highlight there is a problem with communication, it is politer in British culture to highlight that you are the one with the problem, that they are not a bad communicator. So we don't say, you're mumbling, speak up. That would be really rude. We say something like, sorry, I think I need to clean my ears out. I didn't quite catch that. We blame ourselves, not the other person, for the miscommunication. Excuse me, could you repeat that last part? We commonly highlight which part we need repeating. Now, this expression is a question, and it could be used everywhere from down the pub to in the workplace. Could you repeat that last part? Again, if you want to change it, could you repeat the first part? Sorry, I missed the part in the middle, or I missed the bit about blah, blah, blah. So, for example, excuse me, could you repeat the bit about the price, please, if somebody's trying to sell something down the phone? One that is really, really informal is, say that again. This is more common amongst very close friends, somebody that you have a level of intimacy with. Say that again basically is a really direct way of saying repeat yourself. Say that again is something I might say to my very close friend, my best friend. Oh, mate, say that again. What? Again, I use that word what, which with general people that I've just met may come across as a bit rude, but with my best friend, what? Say that again? Would be absolutely fine, but there has to be a level of connection there, a strong level. If this is the year that you really want to take your English to the next level, I have something really exciting to tell you about. At the moment, we're offering a subscription to all of my courses. So there's a course on pronunciation in a modern British RP accent with hours upon hours of lessons aimed to teach you how to pronounce things in a modern British RP accent. There's a course on the 250 most common slang expressions, the 250 most common idioms, and also a course on understanding British people like me, understanding British culture, the way we think and why we say what we say. Plus, on top of those, all of those lessons on the 3 courses, there are live sessions each week with me. There's a conversation club, which is more student-focused, where you meet people from all over the world. And also, there is a feedback session where you ask questions and I give you feedback. 1 hour a week for each of those every single week that you're a member. So there's a lot more information down in the link below, but I look forward to seeing you on the courses and helping you achieve your goals this year. Now let's talk about tone of voice, because tone of voice is everything in British culture. Let's look at this expression. This is one of the expressions I'm going to teach you. Excuse me. It's quite a versatile phrase anyway, but when we're asking somebody to repeat something, the tone of voice is really important. Excuse me? Sounds like you're genuinely asking somebody to repeat, that you've missed some information. They say, oh, my name is... Excuse me? It's asking them to repeat. It sounds genuine. There's a rising tone. If it's a bit flatter, excuse me, it means potentially I did understand what you said and I didn't like it. And then if we do it with this sort of tone of voice, excuse me, it sounds like you've said something really offensive. I have taken offense and I am demanding that you repeat it again. So again, there is a distinct difference between that rising, excuse me, the flatter, excuse me, and excuse me. And as a kind of fourth point, if I say, excuse me, it's probably that you've offended me. You've done something really rude and I want you to acknowledge me, but that's a little bit different. Excuse me. Excuse me could be a pretty dangerous one. So if you say, excuse me, it sounds a bit more like you're accusing the person of saying something wrong. So make sure you get that rising tone. And it's similar with this one. I beg your pardon. I beg your pardon with that light rising tone genuinely sounds like you're asking somebody to repeat. Oh, I beg your pardon? But this one, in my experience, is more common with a negative tone. So maybe somebody says, you're a bit of an idiot. I beg your pardon. What did you just say? Nothing. It's kind of a mixture of asking them to apologize and repeat again so it embarrasses them a bit further. But again, I beg your pardon. It could be a genuine request for somebody to repeat themselves, but I would say that I beg your pardon when used in that way could be seen as a little bit more formal. I beg your pardon? There are more natural examples that we've talked about already, but I beg your pardon and excuse me are two that you might need to be careful with in terms of tone of voice. And in fact, with most of them, you do need to be careful, but a third one that I would say definitely be careful with is, what did you just say? It's got the same idea of, excuse me, I beg your pardon, and what did you just say? This kind of accusation that they have said something wrong if delivered in that flat or negative tone. What did you just say? But again, it could be totally genuine. It could be a rising tone. What did you just say? Again, asking them to repeat. So tone is everything in British English. But those three, excuse me, I beg your pardon, and what did you just say, when delivered with a rising tone, could be completely genuine and asking somebody to repeat themselves. Come again is one that I do hear British people use from time to time. Now, in my opinion, this is a bit more American. It's more common in American English than British English, but it is creeping in. It is really informal, and you may be opening yourself up to banter. We'll talk about that in a moment. But come again could be a way to ask somebody to repeat. Oh, come again? Again, it sounds a bit more American, but I have heard British people use that. And why could it open you up to banter? Well, I've talked about this in a previous lesson, words with double meanings, and sometimes those double meanings are a little bit naughty. Come could mean orgasm. So if somebody says, come again, somebody might joke and say something like, hardly the time. But again, that would be in specific situations, but now you're in on the joke. But this one, as I say, you do hear it from time to time in British English. But let's return to some really British examples. Expressions is, sorry, I was miles away. This basically means that your mind was somewhere else and you missed what that person was saying. In other words, you weren't really concentrating. Sorry, I was miles away. Again, that word sorry is really important. And you could follow that up with one of the other examples. Could you repeat that, please? But sorry, I was miles away is effectively showing that person that you didn't understand. A couple of other common British expressions that do the same thing. I must have been on another planet, or I think I was on another planet, highlighting that you weren't on the planet Earth, you were on another planet, in other words, you weren't listening. And sorry, I was off with the fairies. This is a really common British expression to say your mind was elsewhere. In fact, you can just say, sorry, my mind was elsewhere. That's another expression. Little bonus for you. But sorry, I was miles away. Sorry, I was on another planet. Or sorry, I was off with the fairies. All show that you weren't concentrating on what that person was saying. And in fact, another common way of saying that you weren't listening and that you weren't concentrating is, sorry, I zoned out. I zoned out. It basically means that you were focusing or concentrating on something else or practically on nothing. I zoned out. This one could be a bit rude because it basically shows that you weren't actually focusing at all on what that other person says, but it's really, really honest. And if you really sort of strongly apologize, sorry, I'm not with it today. I zoned out. I'm really sorry. Then you'll get away with it. But again, it's showing that you didn't understand. But another one that's really conversational and really British is, could you run that by me again? This basically means, could you repeat what you said? Now, I've had bosses say this to me. I've made a request and they said, sorry, could you run that by me again? In other words, could you ask me again? Or I've told them something, sorry, could you run that by me again? It basically means repeat what you have just said. Run it by me again, or run that by me again. So it could mean explain or repeat what you just said. In other words, you might want that person to reword it somewhat. And before we move on to the 3-step process, no list would be complete without the word pardon. Now, in general, pardon would be seen as a more formal version of the word sorry. Sorry would be more common in all situations, whereas pardon could sound a little bit more formal. Now, this word is strongly debated by linguists, and it relates to sort of the class structure in the UK. I'm not going to go into it in this lesson, but some people debate this is the kind of word that Hyacinth Bouquet would use to sound a bit more upper class. Whatever side of the debate you stand on, fundamentally, pardon sounds like a more formal version of sorry. And personally, I'm more inclined to use the word sorry. And hopefully you got that reference to Hyacinth Bouquet. It's from a TV show called Keeping Up Appearances. I highly recommend it. And it's about this kind of middle-class woman whose name is spelt like this. And her name is technically spelt Hyacinth Bucket, but she refuses to accept the name or the pronunciation Bucket because it doesn't sound upper class enough. In other words, she wants to sound more upper class. So she says, no, darling, it's bouquet, darling, bouquet, not bucket. It's a really good TV series. I highly recommend it. But some people debate that pardon is the kind of word that Hyacinth Bucket, bouquet, would use to sound a little bit more upper class. But as I say, whatever side of the debate you stand on, pardon is generally seen as slightly more formal, and sorry just works in all situations. But now let's move on to that 3-step process, how to ask somebody to repeat themselves. So first of all, the first step is to apologize, commonly with the word sorry. I'm really sorry, or sorry. The second step, and we often use this second step, is to blame something. Now, we normally blame ourselves, as I've talked about previously in this lesson. Blaming other people for the problem is a little bit rude in British culture. So we commonly blame ourselves or the environment for the miscommunication, blaming maybe the telephone or the general noise in the area you're standing. So for example, oh, sorry, my son in the background, he's making a lot of noise. And then the third step is either to request the person repeat or highlight the problem you're having. So I'm really sorry, my son's making a lot of noise. I didn't catch that. Or I'm really sorry, my son's making a lot of noise. Would you mind saying that again, please? So a couple of example sentences. I'm really sorry that the line isn't great. There's a lot of interference on the line. I didn't get what you said. That's apologizing, highlighting a problem with the situation, and then highlighting the problem. Or, sorry, I think I need to get my ears checked. In other words, there's a problem with my ears. Could you say that again, please? So in that case, we're apologizing, blaming ourselves, and asking the person to repeat. And as I said, this isn't an exhaustive list, but you can let me know your favorite down in the comments below. Please do remember there's a free PDF, and also remember to like and hype this lesson. And if you want to watch this lesson again, you don't need to ask me. You don't need to say, could you say that again, please? Just press play again and enjoy. But thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next lesson.